Colin, thanks for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. It's very exciting for me to come back here to Tufts after some 30 years. I did find my passion for whales while I was a junior here, as Colin said, and it just seduced me, and I've been doing it for, how many years is that? 32 years now. One thing I'll add, since this is the environmental studies group, and you're just talking about the Green Coalition, the Green Corps, I was deeply involved in environmental movement and was a founder of the TAP, the Tufts Environmental Action Program, where one of the things that we pushed through sort of campus-wide education was trying to stop whaling, or getting people on board the efforts to stop whaling, because it was before the moratorium, worldwide moratorium on whaling that was passed in the 80s. So, okay, so what am I going to talk about today? Probably the neatest bit, the neatest aspect of what I'm going to describe is kind of like time travel, because it goes back to a time where classic European taxonomists and biologists were discovering charismatic megafauna and describing them for the first time, and animals that we take for granted today, such as humpback whales. Everyone knows what a humpback whale is. Well, I'm going to talk today about a species, as Colin described, that was discovered for the first time in 2003, and I have had the great fortune to stumble upon the first population of this species that scientists were able to study. And I'm going to tell the story of how that came about, a bit about the background, and then talk about the work that we're doing in Madagascar. So the beast is called the Omura's whale. So Omura's whale is a member of the family Balanopteridae, which includes the largest, the blue whale, and the smallest, the minke whales, both whales that are pretty well known. The minke is very common off of Massachusetts. And you can see from this, this graphic that all these species are pretty much the same body form, just sized down all the way. And there's kind of a gap here, and I just noticed this when I was putting the talk together yesterday, throwing this slide in here, that there's actually a gap right here. And that's eventually where the Omura's whale goes, and it's a little bit bigger than this guy and a little bit smaller than that guy. Hasn't made it into this graphic yet. So the Balanopterids, Balanopteridae, are a group of baleen whales called rorquals. They make their living, they're gulp feeders. They make their living by taking big mouthfuls of water and prey, such as krill or small fish, and they have pleats on their stomach that expand. A gular pouch that fills with water. They close their mouth, and then they filter all the water through baleen plates on the upper jaw, which are like a fingernail material with lots of hairs on the edge, and acts like a sieve that filters all of the water through and maintains the shrimp, krill, or fish in their mouth. So that's why they're called gulp feeders. The Omura's whale, in particular, is a species that was first described in 2003. And this was an animal that had not been recognized before because it had been confused with a species that is somewhat similar called the Brutus whale. And the history is that there had been scientific whaling by the Japanese for Brutus whales in the mid-1970s. It was actually the first, quote, scientific catch for whales that the Japanese instigated before they started scientific whaling in the Antarctic. And during this catch, they took some 350-odd Brutus whales across a large expanse from the western Indian Ocean all the way to the western Pacific Ocean. And of these 350-odd animals, they noticed 8 were not like the others. There were 6 from one site and 2 from another site that were notably smaller, and they called them pygmy Brutus whales. As these researchers continued to do work, they started to notice that these animals were different by allozymes and then genetics they indicated that they were quite different and should be a different species. In 1999, there was a stranding in the south of Japan that genetically matched these animals, and that provided the holotype, which then allowed these scientists to actually declare this is a different species. And they gave it the name Balanoptera omuri in honor of a Japanese biologist named Hideo Omura. Now, what was known in 2003 about this animal is very scant. Their external appearance was described only in terms of what was in whaling records and one really bad black and white photo from a whaling ship, and then a half-decomposed carcass on a beach. And so they knew it looked a little bit like a fin whale. Actually, it was similar to a fin whale, except fin whales are much larger, about 70 feet. These animals were about, well, 10 meters. It looked like a fin whale that had asymmetric coloration pigmentation, which we'll talk quite a bit more about. The right lower jaw is white and the left lower jaw is black. And that's very unusual in the animal kingdom in general, and it's only found in two baleen whales, the Omura's whales and the fin whale. And it lacked a specific feature that diagnoses Brutus whales, and that's Brutus whales have 3 ridges on the top of their head, whereas most other balanopterids, all other balanopterids, have a single ridge down the center. So it lacked these 2 lateral ridges. And that's about all that was known about the animal. Point here to make about what it, the new species. There are lots of cases where there are new species being described just by cleaving them off of a very similar species, 2 populations that were considered to be the same species becoming suddenly different, or subspecies becoming named different subspecies. This is not the case with the Omura's whale. The Omura's whale is an ancient lineage that goes back some 17 million years. And in this phylogeny, what we have here are the Brutus whales, the animals that it had been confused with, which is a group of very closely related subspecies, possibly different species themselves. And basal to that is a species called the sei whale, which is very different, much larger, different habits, very different ecology. And then basal to that clade is the Omura's whale. And this goes back 17 million years, that break. So this is really a case of a species that, a good ancient species, an ancient lineage that had gone unnoticed for as long as humans have been studying whales. Why? They are similar in size to the Brutus whale, and they're also tropical. The Brutus whale and the Omura's whales are exclusively tropical, non-migratory, unlike almost all other baleen whales. So here you have an animal that looks similar only in size, really, and you saw in that first slide how they're similar forms and in the same habitat. The analogy I typically make is coyotes and wolves. If you didn't know they were the same, if they didn't know they were 2 different species and you saw a fleeting glimpse of one in the woods, you might think they were the same thing, particularly in eastern North America, where coyotes tend to be bigger and wolves tend to be smaller. So at the time that the first paper was published, these are the 3 places they were known from the whaling data, from the stranding. After about 10 years of concerted effort by Tadasu Yamada, a colleague and the senior scientist on the definition of the species, looking through museum collections over this Indo-Pacific area, he found several other cases of skulls in museums that were actually Omura's whales and not Brutus whales, so that had been classified as Brutus whales. So that takes us to Madagascar. I've been working in Madagascar since 2004 when I started working with the Wildlife Conservation Society. Originally, I'd been doing humpback whale work, which was a big part of my career up until the point I started working in Madagascar. And I worked primarily along the west coast, and in 2007, landed in this northwest area on an island called Nosy Bay. In Nosy Bay, I originally went there to do dolphin conservation work. two different coastal dolphins, a humpback dolphin and the Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphin. And this figure just shows how my effort, these are track lines, boat track lines, was really coastal because these two species are very, very coastal. Spent 5 years doing that work. Then we shifted with the designation of a MPA, one of the largest MPAs in the Madagascar, marine protected area. In Madagascar, we started doing diversity assessments in offshore waters and more diverse habitat. And it turned out that this area, the Ankavunji marine protected area, and this area off of this region off Nosy Bay is incredibly diverse for cetaceans. Everything from blue whales to pilot whales and spinner dolphins, documented some 15 different species during surveys for this work. And it was during this period where we started seeing something different, something unusual. And in 2011, we had one day, we're still doing coastal surveys. One day we found a mother and calf of what immediately we thought was a Brutus whale. Very excited because very little is known about Brutus whales. For as little as we know about Omura's whales, nothing we knew about Omura's whales. Brutus whales, the species they were confused with, are also poorly understood. We found a mom-calf on one day of the 2-month field season. Got very excited because we thought, wow, maybe this is a breeding area for Brutus whales. We might be able to learn something about them. The next year, I had been working there in 2012 on my typical season. I left my team, my Malagasy team of students, continued working, and they found another group of these animals. That time they found 3 or 4 of them together in a small aggregation, probably feeding, although still didn't really recognize what they were. So it's one sighting, one day of sighting in 2011, one day of sighting in 2012. Then, in 2013, we started working off an offshore island that was right on the edge of a broad shelf. It's about a 20-kilometer shelf from the coast to the shelf break where it goes into deep water, and this island, Nosy Oranja, was situated right at the break there. And we had the opportunity to see what's going on out on that flat shelf, and we started seeing these guys on a regular basis. And it was this video, which I don't think we're going to see very well, that really made us realize these are not Brutus whales. And I described a couple things: the asymmetric jaw and the lack of 3 ridges on the top of the head. Is only a single ridge. This is a mom that's had just taken a feeding lunge, and it's about to turn towards the boat and come across. The video was taken by sticking a camera over the side of the boat. So there's the white jaw. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry. So there's white jaw, 1 ridge, dark jaw on the other side. And then we pan over to the calf. The calf dives, and you see a lot of white pigmentation. Very hard to see on this, unfortunately. So that gave us the initial clue in the field. This is actually not a Brutus whale. It might be an Omura's whale based on the very little description we had. Omura's whales wasn't supposed to be in Madagascar. The nearest one was some 6,000 kilometers away, the nearest sighting in the Cocos Islands. So it was a big deal, and we were all very excited and trying to figure out what the heck was going on. Took a year before we got CITES permits to get the samples back, but when we did the the genetic work, mitochondrial data showed that our samples collected from Omuras in Madagascar matched very clearly with those that were known from the western part of the range, and that long division between the sei whales and the Brutus whales that are over here. So that allowed us to publish the first paper describing the species, both in terms of its physical appearance as well as its some of its ecology and behavior. And on Appearance, again, here's that video clips. Here's the white jaw, the dark jaw. The gape is also asymmetric, but reversed, dark on one side, white on the other. The single ridge, lack of these two ridges. Has a beautiful coloration pattern. This blaze here with dark stripes that's over the eye. This is asymmetric, so it only occurs on the right side. The left side does not have that pattern. Similar to a fin whale, although fin whales don't have as much detail. They have only one or two black stripes as opposed to this four that you see here. Nice slanted dorsal fin, which is quite different than Brutus whales, which look more like a dolphin. They just stick into the body. And this bright chevron pigmentation pattern on the right side. Another video, just because videos are fun. This animal is upside down right now, so this is at the top of its head, and this is its lower jaw. Here's its eye, and it's going to spin as it passes. And when it goes down, it'll come back up, and we'll get a biopsy of it. So this illustrates getting a biopsy. So there it is turning. There's that single ridge. The left jaw, again, is dark. This video gives a good idea of how long and serpentine they are. They tend to be very skinny whales, which I think is related to living in the tropics where there's not a whole lot of productivity in food. Going to come up to the surface, the video come out. You'll see my crossbow here in the top corner. Quickly, there's the shot, biopsy. Get a small piece of skin that's about 1.5 centimeters long and about 0.5 centimeter wide. Standard technique used all over the world for biopsying free-ranging cetaceans. I got to work with an illustrator this past year to develop a real illustration for what this animal looks like, and she did a fantastic job, Frederique Lucas. It really is one of the most beautiful whales. And that is probably the most common response that I get from colleagues, people that work with baleen whales. They see the pictures of this animal and this illustration, they go, wow, what a beautiful whale. And I think I'm not biased. Well, I am biased, but I think it's accurate to say this is among one of the most beautifully pigmented of the baleen whales. And pointing out here how similar it is to a fin whale. So these are fin whales. Again, the picture doesn't quite show, but you know, they have this blaze, they have the asymmetric pigmentation where it's white on the right side, the flippers, a lot of similarities. This is a real confusing aspect of the evolutionary history of these animals because there's no really good explanation for why both of these species have asymmetric coloration and have such similarities in their pigmentation patterns. They're not closely related. Fin whales are not basal to this clade. There are other species in between, so there's not a good parsimonious explanation for ancestral lineage being the result of these pigmentation. They're ecologically entirely different. Fin whales are a migrating species that makes its living in the temperate waters. Moor's whales are exclusively tropical. So it's hard to make a convergence explanation. And the similarities are so similar that I can't believe they would evolve independently. So there's something else going on, something with ancestral polymorphisms or central genes that are dormant in other species lighting up in these two species for some reason, or maybe introgression between lineages. That's a mystery to be solved. So what do we know about the global distribution of Omuras at this point? So this again is where we stood in 2003. This is not a spot, that's the label, the legend. So this is where we're in 2003 after 10 years looking in museum collections. At the time that we published the paper in 2015, there were two others that had been strandings that had been published in Northwest Australia, and this one was a real surprise of Mauritania. So by 2015, the range of this animal is already starting to spread as people started finding things out. And I had found a couple other instances of photographs that were actually Omura's whales. Now, 2 years later, it's really filled in. And this is probably because of, well, for two things. One is that there's now a description of the animal for people to look at, both for physical appearance as well as acoustics, which I'll describe in a bit. And also, we got a lot of press for this, which was kind of cool. It's the first time in my career I ever got press on anything, so it was kind of novel. And suddenly it launched this interest where people are looking for Omura's whales in their habitats. Researchers that are, in areas where there might be Omura's whales are starting to look for them and finding, wow, those Brutus whales that these animals we thought were Brutus whales are actually Omura's. That's kind of neat. I think probably the species is a pantropical across the entire globe. The only ocean basin it has not yet been identified in is the Western Pacific, and I think it's only a matter of time before some population is discovered. They tend to be tropical and remote areas and often in developing countries, which is another reason why they haven't been found very widely yet. Okay, now going back to Madagascar, I'm going to try to fit a lot of information in here, talking about the study that we've been doing since 2013. This is two figures showing our effort before we sighted we knew about Omura's whales. This is all the effort in deep water offshore and then coastal water. And then once we found Omura's whales, this is the 2 years where we're really just focusing on those animals on the shelf. Here's all the sightings, some 250 sightings at this point. They're really a shelf species. They're not found close to shore, which is why I didn't see them during the dolphin work. They're not found offshore at all in the deep water. They're found on the shelf, about 50 meters, which is very interesting bit. We see moms and calves on a seasonal basis. And we see young calves. We've seen young calves in October, November, when most of the time when they're there, and we've seen them in August. And there's been young calves noted elsewhere in April, May, in other areas. So that suggests that the breeding season is really protracted. If there are young calves being born at such a wide range of months, the breeding season may turn out that they're either aseasonal breeders or it's a protracted breeding season, very much unlike typical migratory whales, which have a constrained breeding season. We do see recaptures of individuals across years. Still working up the photo identification data to get numbers on it, but here's an example of a female that was sighted in 3 of 4 different years, once in an aggregation, in that 2012 aggregation that my team stumbled upon, and then the next year in 2013 with a calf, and then again in 2 other years. So that's indication that there's some site fidelity. And also the genetics indicate that there's very low genetic diversity. 1 haplotype among 18 adults, 1 mitochondrial haplotype. All of this suggests that it's a small resident population. Again, somewhat unusual for baleen whales. When you find an Omura's whale, it's typically, quote, by itself in terms of what we think of as a pod. You don't see groups of Omura's whales in close proximity like you see of other whales, like humpback whales, for instance. However, when you find one Omura's whale, there's typically others, several in an area of just a couple kilometers, a few hundred meters from each other. So we regularly see these loose aggregations. And this is an example of one-day track. Spent about 3 hours in this 2 by 5 kilometer area and sighted 12 different individuals, each color representing the photograph of a different specific individual. So this is I think the largest aggregation that we're actually able to identify the most number of animals. Last year, 2016, we did some satellite tagging to get an idea of what their range was outside of our immediate study area, which is only about 40 kilometers of a stretch of coast. And we satellite tagged 4 individuals and got actually very good durations from 1 month to 2 months, which is an excellent duration for a satellite tag, particularly the type that we were using, which is a low invasive tag that's attached to the dorsal fin as opposed to implanted in the body, which is more invasive and typically used on larger whales. And they ranged of, okay, let me show a video of actually tagging, and I'll talk about the results of it. Let me see that. Kind of hard to see, huh? There's in that shot you actually get to see the pigmentation pattern really well. So the tags attached to the dorsal fin, and like I said, they stayed on for about 1 month to 2 months. So you had 2 animals that lasted about 30 days and 2 animals that lasted about 60 days. And during that time, here's the tagging site, Nosy Bay. This is each individual. They went no more than 100 to 150 kilometers in each direction. And the color coding on these charts indicate the timing of the position of that tag. And what it indicates is that these animals did not range, during the entire time from here to here. They define this range within the first week to 2 weeks of the deployment. And then they went back and forth, like this animal here. It went first up to here, then it came down, and it came back up, and then it came all the way back down again. So they were really moving back and forth across this fairly constricted range. To give you an idea of how that compares, I have some other data on humpback whales that satellite tagging projects. And here we are, here's Africa and the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, Madagascar. And this is a tagging project of Madagascar humpback whales, which gives the tracks of some 23 individuals, all the way up to Somalia, all the way down here, and even just around Madagascar in a period of 24 days, which was the mean duration for these tags. These animals covered some 2,000 kilometers around the coast of Madagascar. Another population of Arabian Sea animals, of humpback whales in the Arabian Sea. This is a non-migratory population of humpbacks. And even though they're migratory, they're still covering about 1,000 kilometers of coast. There's Mora's whales in comparison. Just about 350 kilometers of range in that small area. In a period of time, that's twice that of the Madagascar humpbacks. So that's really, really unusual for baleen whales, because baleen whales tend to move around a lot. And that brings up a lot of different interesting things, as well as issues for conservation because of the protection that's needed for animal that's in such a constrained region. Okay, I'm switching gears again and going to talk about acoustics. Acoustics is a favored focus of mine. And when we first started seeing these animals, I immediately put the hydrophone in the water because, well, see if what they're saying, if they have a vocalization. Heard nothing. But baleen whales often make calls that you can't hear, so we recorded for 10, 20, 30 minutes in the presence of the animals. Went home that night, pulled up a spectrogram, frequency by time. It's a graphic representation of sound, and saw these calls that I knew immediately were new. No, it had never been described before. That was very exciting itself. It's a very low frequency. It spans 20 hertz to about 50 hertz, 15 hertz to about 50 hertz. And it's amplitude modulated or pulsive. As you can see on the waveform, it goes up and down. I'll play an example of it sped up 5 times. Not particularly exciting, but actually really interesting. And here's 2 times, which the sound system should get some of it. Oops, that's not 2 times. Here we go. You can barely hear it. So at real time, it's half as low as that. And I've heard them in the water, going scuba diving. You hear these, if you're close to one, it just vibrates in your chest. And that's a great experience. So to assess the acoustic behavior of these animals, we use passive acoustic monitoring, putting these recorders out. I won't go into details about the methodology, but we had 5 different sites across our range where we put remote recorders down, and they recorded for a year of time to give us some ideas about what not only how the animal, the acoustic behavior of the animal is, but what acoustics can tell us about the temporal and spatial distribution of the animal. So I'll first talk about the acoustic behavior. And the first thing to say is that this is song. It's not just a call, it's a song. And what is a song? 4 different characteristics. They're stereotyped. A song is repetitive in a rhythmic sequence. You have multiple individuals displaying in a chorus, and they tend to be sexually selected trait. Well, they are sexually selected trait typically by males, just like bird song. And whale song is known, particularly in the Balanopteridae, most well known in humpbacks, which is a very complex song. It's known to be a very complex song. But pretty much all of the balanopterids that have been studied have a song that's relatively simple. It's just a single unit that's repeated over and over again. And so now what I'm going to do is describe that this is, sure. That's what this slide is going to sort of address, but we haven't really addressed that yet. So this is, there's 3 examples here of that call or the unit. And these 2 are from the same individual because they're consecutive in a series. This is from a different individual, so it's on a different day. And they're very similar, but it's not just the fact that they're similar. There's a very specific stereotyped pattern to the pulse train, which I'm going to ask you to listen for. And specifically, we're going to listen at the end for these 2 pulses at the very end, which is kind of like shaving a haircut 2 pence. So that's individual 1, first unit, individual 1, second unit. And now a different individual. So the stereotypy is in the pattern of the pulses, which is also unusual because stereotypy, recognizable patterns, is usually in the pattern of the units themselves, like woo, woo, woo. You know, you hear that. You hear that every time a whale does it. You know it's a single phrase. We've discerned 2 different phrases. Sometimes they have this little unit after the pulsive unit, and here's a series of them alternating between the 2. They sing in series. So this is one individual we're talking about here is a spectrogram that's of 1 hour. Each line is 10 minutes, and it's continuous from 0 to 60 minutes. And this is one individual singing. It's a song unit once every 150 to 180 seconds, and sped up 100 times. Here's what it sounds like. kind of like a cricket or maybe a frog. It chirps, which is song. Crickets and frogs are singing. That is considered song. Here's an 8-hour example. Now every line is 2 hours long. And this is a single individual, an unbroken sequence for 8 hours. The longest unbroken sequence we have at this point is 12 hours long. So they sing. And the other aspect of this is that these animals the songs do not travel very far, only about 5 kilometers at the outset is what I'm guessing from what we've observed. So this animal came in, started singing, and stayed in the area. He didn't move through. If he was moving through, he would have passed in and out of range of the hydrophone within about within an hour, probably half an hour on the outside. So this animal was stationary, singing. This is the chorus. There's at least 4 animals here. That's 1. That's 2. And there are 2 more in the background. So going back to that slide about aggregations, what's happening in those aggregations? They might be groups of animals together feeding on a common food source, which probably are in some cases, but they also might be a group of animals singing in what might be considered a lek. And here's that's a chorus of Omura's whales. Kind of sounds like a field of crickets, right? Some of the data from the long-term recorders. 4 different sites, definitely differences between in the number of calls recorded, so they have preferences for where they sing or where they hang out. This is a year of recording from December to November. This is number of days per week in which song was heard. And the take home here is that they are there and they're singing all year round. This is very, again, unusual. This is a strong indicator that this is actually a resident animal and they're there all year round, as opposed to a humpback whale down here, which comes for only the austral winter. And during that time, again, now here this is the number of calls, so this is a little bit more detail, number of calls per day. Although they're there the whole time, there's fluctuations, and they vary from week to week and how often it is. So what's going on? We're pulling pieces together of this puzzle. We're learning a little bit about the distribution, both spatially and temporally, of a species that we know very little about, of a non-migratory whale. What determines these? And a big part of that is probably food and feeding behavior and availability of food resources, which again, for a baleen whale, a migratory baleen whale doesn't have the same pressures that these guys have. They're making their living in the tropics all year round, so they're feeding and breeding in the same places. Humpback whales, when they're breeding, they're not feeding, so they're not driven by it. We see feeding. We've never seen them feeding on fish. We've only seen them feeding on a small euphausid. Some other aspects which should probably start speeding up. They have a very large gular pouch. And that's probably because they're feeding on a very thin soup, a ligotrophic environment where there's not a whole lot of food resources. In 2016, we witnessed a trophic cascade that was fascinating. We went from a period where we saw very few whales and very little feeding, and the whales we did see were coming in, they were moving, kind of like they were looking for food. And then over about a 2-week period, we started getting a lot of rain, and then we got these blooms of this trichodesmium, cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, vast mats that were, hundreds of meters to a kilometer in length. And this was followed by big swarms of krill that we identified as pseudoeuphausia. Can't really see it there. And then that was followed by some of the most spectacular feeding of Omuras that we had seen to date. Animals gorging themselves on these blooms of krill. We also saw multi-species assemblages. So this area is also a hotspot for whale sharks that come to the specific area off the coast of Nosy Bay within access to ecotourism groups at the same time that the Omuras whales are there. And I said Omuras whales are year-round. Our data shows they're year-round, but they move around within that restricted range. And they're only off the coast of Nosy Bay within a couple kilometers, so accessible to ecotourist boats during about a 3-month period. And during that same time, the whale sharks are there as well. And in 2016, we saw these feeding assemblages of planktivores that include Omuras whales, sometimes scores of mobilas, mantas, whale sharks, bonito, and terns. Okay, now summarizing, trying to bring all that together. What have we learned about Omuras whales in these past 3 years? First of all, it's turning out that they're probably a global species, and the range is likely fragmented, at least from the Western Pacific to the West Indian Ocean and into the Atlantic, but probably throughout all tropical waters of the globe. The population in Madagascar, which is still the only population that's been studied, it's the only population that is accessible for study that's been discovered to date. There are probably others out there that just haven't been recognized. Indicates it's probably a small resident population with a low genetic diversity. Feeding and breeding are occurring at the same time of year, all or contemporaneously, and probably at least during the same time of year, which is quite different than migratory baleen whales, which have a separation in feeding and breeding. Breeding in the winters and feeding in the summers. The population appears to be non-migratory and quite resident to a fairly restricted area. And we have this evidence for song, and I tend to think it's probably a lek, like you see with grouse and some African ungulates and humpback whales. What's driving this? A lek is it's both a descriptor for the breeding system as well as the specific behavior, where a group of males do some form of display, either visual or acoustic or both, in a constrained spatial space where there are little or no resources. So they're not guarding resources that females need. They're displaying. And females are coming to assess the males based on their display, as opposed to coming to the male because it's controlling a resource. And females exert female choice in order to determine who gets matings. So some speculations about what's going on, and particularly with the feeding ecology. So these animals, unlike migratory baleen whales, are feeding in tropical oligotrophic waters. There's not a whole lot of productivity. So the restricted range is probably related to the fact that prey resources are limited and patchy. So if you, as an individual, can learn when you can find them where, you're going to stick to that place because you could reliably find them. And that the local productivity drives the patchiness, drives that distribution, and probably some sort of pattern that's related to seasonal changes in the specific area. So the seasonality of productivity drives the temporal variability of the presence of the planktivore, where they are at different times of year. And there are several different planktivores that are queuing into the same productivity. ending with a bit about conservation. So this is a coastal area. It's subject, and this is a coastal species. So they're on the shelf, but they're on near coast. That puts them in interaction with humans. Habitat degradation, boat traffic is an issue. Also, potential interactions with fisheries, entanglements can be an issue. In Madagascar and other parts of the range, seismic exploration is an issue. And these animals in Madagascar have definitely been insonified by seismic exploration, very, very loud, low-frequency noises that have the potential to disturb feeding and other behaviors. And probably in our specific area in Madagascar, the biggest danger right now is a mining operation on the peninsula near where they range that could produce pollutions in the effluents and affect the productivity of the area in general. And this is a big issue for Madagascar and this population and any population of animals in a developing country, because there's very little regulation. And these governments, like the government of Madagascar, is very easily bought off by large companies that have an interest in mining resources of some sort. In this case, rare earth elements, extremely profitable for mining industries, and particularly environmental damaging. So this is an issue across the globe, and how to conserve, how to protect species like this is the real challenge. I think I'm probably out of time, right? So just some future work, a bunch of different questions that we're hoping to look at through collaborations. And then the big question here for this group is, how do you conserve a species like this? You have a species, a population that is resident, is local to areas, does not move out of these areas. In some ways, that makes them easier to protect than migratory species, because you can protect all of their habitat in a relatively small area, as opposed to a migratory whale that travels, thousands of kilometers each year, and you have all this range that you need to protect. But when you have these populations in coastal areas in developing nations where there's poor regulation and very little motivation for regulations, and actually motivation in the opposite direction to deregulate, how do you conserve those populations? There's no answers. I'm just posing that, and that's a major issue within marine mammal biology, as well as all of tropical biology, for the future conservationists of the world to tackle. Thank you for coming. Acknowledge my funding sources, my team, mostly Malagasy. My funding sources: International Whaling Commission, Marine Mammal Commission, Prince Albert, and National Geographic Society. Thank you.
For a few questions.
Do you have any rough idea of the numbers of the population in Madagascar?
Haven't gotten there yet, but from the number of resites we see throughout the year, and my gut feeling is probably close to 100, probably under 200, maybe under 100, maybe just over 100, that range. It's not thousands, it's not tens, because we definitely see at least 50 individuals a year, I guess. And we're in the process of doing photo marker capture, which is challenging because it's not an easy pattern to recognize individuals with.
Any idea about the age they can live to?
I wouldn't even venture that. Well, it's an interesting topic, though, because, as an example, humpback whale, very well studied, was always thought to live 40 to 50 years. But it's starting to look like and bowheads and right whales, similarly, I guess. But it's starting to look like the methods that were used were off by a factor of 2. And it involves counting layers in an earplug, and there's been a debate as whether or not they lay down 2 layers a year or 1 layer a year. But it's looking like it's probably that 40 or 50 years is probably 80 to 100 years for humpback whale. So for these guys, I think that's a hard one to guess because they're ecologically so different.
So I have a quick question, which is I have a lot of students who are environmental studies students who said, I really want to be a field biologist. I don't want to be stuck behind a desk. I don't want to be at a computer. So I was wondering if you could offer some ideas of what are the kinds of training you did, a master's and a PhD. Are there a skill set that you're seeing amongst field biologists in terms of sort of preparing themselves to be not stuck behind a computer screen?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So it hits on a really central topic in my life and career right now, because as I've moved through my career, how do you describe yourself? I used to describe myself as a behavioral ecologist, and I describe myself as a conservation biologist. But more and more I say I'm a field biologist because it's becoming a rare thing. And particularly in biology, everyone knows how the field has moved towards really laboratory, but even in marine mammals, and what used to be entirely field biologists, fields like acoustics and genetics have developed a version of a marine mammal biologist that never works with marine mammals, that's only working with sounds in a computer or genes in or DNA. So I advocate becoming a field biologist. How do you become a field biologist? I think it's getting more and more difficult. Personally, I got my education in 2 steps. I did a master's degree at Moss Landing Marine Labs, which was a really strongly field-based program where you are taught how to do field biology and you're taught how to do science. It really is a very practical how to do science education. And I got my PhD at University of Michigan, which is a very academic program, and it really gave me a foundation in theory on evolutionary biology. And for me, that was a great combination. I will say it's a matter of passion, because more and more it's very difficult. If you're after an academic job, to be a field biologist, you have to be a generalist. To be a good field biologist, you really have to be a naturalist. You have to be a generalist. You don't see academic jobs for generalists. You see more and more academic jobs for very specific specializations. So it's very hard for someone with my skill set to actually compete for an academic position. So what is it? I want to both advocate people going into field, students that have that passion to go into field biology, get to know a system or an animal firsthand, and become a generalist, become a jack of all trades, a Renaissance student. And at the same time, you have to be realistic and caution that that's not the most practical way to success in the way the field is today. So, go in open-eyed.
Any other questions?
So putting on my hat as a historical ecologist for a sec, I just wanted to ask about this whale's small populations related to historic human harvesting or related to low biology, low frequency of those.
Okay, I would say it's almost certainly not because of human harvesting. Although there was hunting in some cases in a few isolated areas around the world, both local hunting and then the Japanese scientific hunting, it's minor compared to what was done on the large whales in the Antarctic, for instance. We're still trying to figure out what the ecology of these animals are. So we're starting to figure out what it looks like in Madagascar. I've just described that. Second question is, well, is this representative of the species globally? That will take a long time to figure out. And then if it is, these are small local populations that characterizes the species, then there's likely something about the ecology of this animal living in a tropical environment that drives that that these are just small isolated populations. Now, I think that's probably the case, and that it's probably related to limited food resources and the fact that if you don't have a very productive environment like the Antarctic, you're taking risks by moving out of the areas that you know where you learned that there's food. So,
following on the ecology type question, you mentioned the species coming together, and I was curious about the whale shark and what the interactions of the species were.
So that brings up a point that I hadn't touched on. We see whale sharks and Omura's whales in the same general region at the same time of year. However, we don't see them feeding on the same patches, right? We typically see whale sharks with bonito, and actually the ecotourists find the whale sharks by looking for bonito schools. And then maybe a kilometer away, 2 kilometers away, you might find a group of Omura's whales. And whenever you find Omura's whales, you look in the water and you'll see mobiles. So they seem to be different feeding assemblages, micro assemblages, I guess you might say, feeding on probably feeding on different prey items that are likely driven by the same productivity balloon, because they are coming at the same time of year. So there's likely some processes that are occurring, probably due to rainfall, rainy season, runoff from the island, introducing some limiting nutrient that creates a primary productivity bloom, and then somewhere up the chain, a diversification of different prey types that are fed on by these two different large megafauna. That's the picture that's sort of coming together.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and your tale and your research and ecology of this fascinating species. Let's give them a hand.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm remembering that there's a rainfall gradient in Madagascar. So my recollection is this. So maybe this is a recollection based on that you have prompted me to think this. That the northern part of the island is wetter than the southern part.
Absolutely.
So are they feeding where the major rivers are coming out? So if you talked about the